The problem is that if you're too close to the thing yourself, too much,
Hmm.
and it's really hard to not know what you know,
Hmm.
and it's really hard to imagine to understand that other people don't know what. That's like the big barrier. That's like the whatever the thing was in Star Trek, the barrier that you can.
Yeah,
And uh, that's part of the reason why I always felt like the best thing for that was usability testing,
for
was
sure.
getting people to actually watch usability tests, because you can only you're I've seen
Yeah.
so many people who broke through that barrier just by sitting through a couple of usability tests where as I like to say, it really is like light bulb goes off over their head where they go, holy
Yeah.
crap, they actually don't understand that.
I'm Aran Jor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Steve Krug. Steve is one of the founding fathers of user experience and usability design, and a best-selling author of two foundational classics in the field. Don't Make Me Think, his guide to usability design, with over 600,000 copies in print today, and Rocket Surgery Made Easy, a friendly guide to usability testing. He based his writing on decades spent as usability consultant for a wide variety of clients like Apple, Bloomberg.com, Lexus.com, NPR, and the International Monetary Fund, and continues to consult through his firm Advanced Common Sense. In this conversation, we discuss Steve's early fascination with the art of a good and accessible explanation, his circuitous path to usability and writing, being offered an unprecedented book deal in advance to write Don't Make Me Think, the importance of smart and creative friends in opening doors, his views about the evolution of UX design and the additional professionalism and fragmentation that has occurred since his books came out, and Steve's next project, a book about writing, which comes from Steve's own challenges with writing, which he describes as excruciating. We also touch on the role and value of respect in the course of explanation, and the fact that there is no shame in not knowing something you're learning for the first time. So let's jump right in with Steve Krug. So I'm sitting here with Steve Krug. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
So I usually start these days with the situation, and just to hear how COVID has treated you, how you're doing, what's it like where you are, all that kind of stuff.
It's my wife and I spend a lot of we alternate between being grateful that we have a nice house to live in and we can even get groceries delivered if we need to, so we don't have to get out that much. And so we're both relatively old, so we're being extraordinarily careful. We see friends in the backyard from time to time. So we're alternating between grateful, and my wife is intensely bored.
Mm.
And because so much of her usual day to day has been interrupted. And also, my son is living nearby, which is fortunate. So we get to see him
Great.
because he's as cautious as we are. So we're fine. Everybody else, not so great. We're trying to give money to food banks and whatnot because it's tough.
Yeah.
But we're privileged, so we're okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of status.
You know, you said you listened to the Kathy Davis episode, and she said, "I can't complain, but I really want to," and I think
I
that
know. I love
captures it.
that. I wrote that down. I passed that along to people.
It's
It's like the
beautiful.
perfect reply.
Yeah, and I'm feeling very privileged to be in Israel right now. I already had my first shot of the vaccine,
Oh, good.
and in a few days, in about a week, I'm getting the second shot.
Great.
I think Israel is leading right now in terms of percentage of, I think we're nearing 30%, which is crazy high. And so I'm very grateful for that. And I haven't been to my parents' place in a long time, essentially since
Yeah.
February. And so I'm going to go, hopefully in about 2 weeks, I'll be safe to go visit them. They already got the vaccine. Yeah.
How do you have to travel? Is that by car or what's
Take a car or a train. The trains are running in a very kind of strict rules. You have to order online. You have to order a ticket online, and it's very spaced out. But yeah, I'll either should take the train or just take a car.
Yeah.
But besides being bored, it sounds like you're on the good side of this.
My existence hasn't changed that much because I've worked at home for 40 years and I don't get out much. So one of the things I miss most actually is going to my local Starbucks and sitting there for an hour or two writing or reading. That's most of my socialization. And we still get to see friends. I get together with couples in our backyard, and
Mm.
even we picked up some radiant heaters now that it's so cold and whatever. But my routine hasn't changed very much.
Yeah, I remember seeing a cartoon that I resonated with. It says, "So I found out my normal lifestyle is called social isolation."
Right. Exactly.
um, so it was very enlightening because it wasn't nearly as hard on me as most of my friends being at home. It's interesting. I want to get you're one of the founding fathers of the whole discipline of UX, and there's a lot of really interesting questions coming. But I like to really tie it to the person and the life a little bit. And so my first question is always, what's something that you've believed since a very early age, since childhood, that was driving you throughout this and is still driving you today?
I actually thought about this one a little bit. I see if I can remember what I thought about it, because I did listen to that one interview and you asked the question, and it struck me as a good question. One of my answers would be, this is going to sound pretty odd, but that it's actually more important to be nice than to be smart. I was one
Interesting.
of those kids in school who, like, school was dead easy for me and all that stuff. And obviously there were kids in my class who were having I remember some really sad things, kids having a really hard time.
Mm.
And I saw some smart kids who tended not to be very nice. It's almost like as a class, they weren't very nice. And it really put me off. Now, he'll said in a natural inclination to hide the fact that I was smart so as not to get bullied or excluded or whatever. But I think that actually was one of my founding principles, was that smart people aren't necessarily nice, and it's more important to be nice, however that strikes
Yeah.
you. But it
Interesting.
was certainly key to me.
Interesting. And when you say more important to be nice, is it an ethical statement? Is it it's actually more important because it's more important for success and for is it all of the above?
I think it's mostly an ethical statement. If I
Hmm.
stop to think about it, I forget, it was some cartoon. I think it might have been Pogo, which nobody's familiar with anymore. It's a cartoon from back in the 40s and 50s here, about a possum who lived in the Okefenokee swamp in Florida and his animal friends. And there was it was also from a key graduation address that Kurt Vonnegut gave, which I heard on the radio many years ago. And the
Hmm.
gist of it was, from Pogo, it was goodness is better than badness because it's nicer. And Vonnegut said essentially the same thing. He said, you can be basically a terrible person or a good person. It just works out better if you're a good person. That's
Mm-mm.
not, it's not a rule of the universe or whatever, but it just works out that way. And
Yeah.
I guess my parents, and my mother in particular, was very ethical person, but not ethical she was a weird combination. She was like extraordinarily ethical, but completely not judgmental. I mean, my wife and my friends say they don't know anybody they've ever met who was less judgmental than she was. But
Huh.
she was like serious Catholic and had to believe a lot of stuff. And so it was probably an ethical thing, basically.
Yeah.
But there was a note of self-preservation in there, that this is, my life is going to go better if I'm not a
Interesting.
jerk.
Interesting.
I can fly under the radar.
I think I was in my 20s when I learned that lesson, so probably later than you. Um, but it's very interesting and very timely, I feel, with the whole presidential thing in the US.
Oh yeah.
One of the things that made me hopeful, and we don't usually get too deep into politics, but one of the things that made me
I have no problem with that. I have kept my
okay.
politics out of it. Twitter is the only social networking that I've ever used, and have used it mostly for blatant self-promotion for business purposes. But I have strictly maintained, I'm not revealing my politics here
Okay.
policy.
Okay.
However, at this point,
Yeah.
since we now have a sane person as president over here, and again, our apologies to everyone in the world on behalf of our country. I'm willing to talk about it. It's like
Yeah.
I may lose some readers, but like not.
Yeah. I think even people who support
Trump would admit he's not a very empathetic, nice person. Nobody thinks, nobody, even people who support him don't think, oh, I support him because he's nice.
Oh no, they
Uh,
don't. I actually heard something very good just yesterday, the day before on National Public Radio here. Woman talking about Trump supporters and Trump in general, and the word she used was gross. She said he's gross, which I'd never heard applied to him before, but it's almost the most apt word. I don't know if it has the same meaning there, but it just means somebody who's crude uh,
yeah,
and icky. And she said that, which I've known for a long time now, is just that doesn't matter to the people who support him. In fact, they like that. I have a whole speech about it, which I won't go into. But the essence of it is, yes, these people are right. We are not egalitarian. What's the opposite? We're
hierarchical.
elitists.
Oh yeah,
No,
elitist.
we're elitists, and we have been having better lives than they have, and we don't care about them very much. And it's right for them to think that we're making their lives miserable, and
Hmm.
that they want one of their guys to be talking for them, and that they don't really care what he's saying, that as long as they feel like he's sticking it to us. And
Yeah.
clearly he was able to stick it to us for 4 years. We woke up every morning terrified.
I hope that's enough. I hope to God
So
that's enough.
I don't know. I am
Yeah.
optimistic, but I feel like it's kind of like trust but verify. I hold out optimism,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I don't know if how it's perceived over there, but I was a Joe Biden supporter, like from long before it was in any way
Yeah.
fashionable. This is the only person who can beat him, and he'd be really good at it. And he's so far paying off on that.
Yeah, he seems
So
to be doing the right thing. I think
we could spend the
for
whole time talking about politics.
yeah, we will probably move on. We'll probably move on.
Yeah,
But I think in terms of my view into this is fully American. I lived in America
yeah,
for a decade, and I follow all these podcasts. But what I was going to say is part of the what gave me hope under Trump
uh-huh,
was he's not a very nice person, and therefore he's probably not going to be a very effective person. And
right.
because he's a terrible manager, because managers
Oh
actually
yeah,
have to be empathetic and nice
yeah, yeah.
to get things done. And there would be issues of dysfunction, but I wasn't ever at any point really worried that he was going to be effective enough to overturn an election, because you actually
Uh,
have to have an effective team and who trust you,
right.
and it requires empathy. It requires to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
successful.
No, by the time he got to the overturning, he was so crazed.
Yeah.
But the fact is, the thing I keep coming back to is, this is really scary. Had it not been for COVID, he would be president now.
Yep.
He was certainly going to get reelected. If there's one good thing about COVID, which is hard to imagine, it got him out of there.
Mm.
So
Okay, so going back to being nice,
yeah,
and
and
you wrote
UX and
yeah, yeah. You wrote somewhere that you set out to replace Mr. Wizard. That was your
yes,
first dream.
this a
Yeah.
distinctly American character. Yeah.
So do you want to talk about who Mr. Wizard was for you and how that kind of morphed into what you ended up doing?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Mr. Wizard it was a TV show in the 50s when I was first watching TV on Saturday afternoons called Watch Mr. Wizard. And Mr. Wizard was a guy named Don Herbert, who even at that time was, he was probably in his 50s at that time. And the set was his home science workshop slash, it wasn't a laboratory, it was more like a workshop. And
Mm.
he would invite two neighborhood kids in and do science experiments for them.
Awesome.
And as I like to say, you can just start the list of reasons why this show couldn't exist
Mm.
now. Inviting neighborhood kids in to your quote workshop. Just even the concept at this point would be beyond the pale. And he did brilliant demonstrations of scientific principles using common household objects, as I like to say. And he did the fission reaction with mousetraps and ping pong balls. He did the classic one where you hang a bowling ball from a wire and you draw it back to Billy's chin and you let it go. And
Mm.
you say, "Do you think this will? Are you okay with
Hit you
this?"
back.
And
Yeah.
it will never come back further. But he did great explanations of science, and I loved it because I was interested in science and explanations, and I always thought this would be a great job to do that. And I figured he had to retire sometime, so that was in the back of my head. That was my um, objective.
Interesting.
And uh, it turned out that he didn't retire. He actually, the show ended like in the like around 1960 or whatever, but he did a comeback on another network in like the early 90s. They
Wow.
revived the show, and he was still doing a great job. And then after he finally did retire, a guy here named Bill Nye the Science Guy started
Yep.
doing essentially the same show for
Yeah.
another generation.
Yep.
So it was, as a simple career choice of slipping in when he retired, that was not workable. That was my direction, if
Interesting.
anything. So I kind
When
of,
I think about what you ended up doing, there's
yeah,
an element of, first of all, he made things very accessible.
yeah,
He made complex things very accessible,
yeah.
and
That was what I
and
liked.
he
Yeah,
and he's a teacher, and you're
yeah,
both of these things in a very real sense. And he taught a lot of people how to think about UX. So
yeah.
it's very interesting. But you got into, am I right that you got into printing and typesetting after this?
I did, and I went to college. I went to college, and because I was pretty naive and didn't understand how college worked or much about how the world worked, I majored in physics because I
Mm,
figured science. And also, I had developed some interest in like nuclear energy and whatever. So physics, and then because I didn't understand calculus at all, basically flunked out of physics and had a choice between English lit and psychology as two things that interested me, and also had a lot of electives, so you didn't have to take any classes that were too early in the morning. And
mm.
and
Right.
ended up in English, which was English lit, which was like, it's sad to say it, but I don't think I've ever made any use of anything that I learned in getting my English lit degree.
My undergrad is in history. I love it. I love how
uh,
useless it's been, but it's not actually useless. I'm sure if I trace back my thinking about many topics, it leads back to it. But you ended up
yeah,
writing. Yeah.
I ended up writing, which had nothing to do with the lit degree. I actually took a short story writing course, creative writing with short stories in college, which taught me that I had no ability at all in creative writing. I just couldn't think of anything to write about. So nonfiction was completely out, which was easy. I was nice to know that. I was like never had to agonize over it at all. But then when I graduated, so the typesetting, and when I graduated, friends of mine had inherited through a story which we won't go into, a typesetting shop. Not in I should tell briefly the story that basically it was a typesetting shop, was for the student newspaper. It was Boston College, and it was for the student newspaper. And the student newspaper printed a transcript that they got a board of directors meeting, which was not flattering at all to the board of directors. So the board of directors of the school basically threw the newspaper off campus. However, they had already signed contracts for this typesetting equipment for the student newspaper. So
Wow.
the student newspaper set up a typesetting shop, and so my first job was as a proofreader at this typesetting shop, and through that, typesetting was getting computerized at the time, and so I was the person who was interested in the computers and taught everybody how to use them and kept stuff running and whatever. So that was even though I had looked longingly at the like Altair and whatever the other one was, computers in Popular Mechanics, not long before that, where you could buy a computer for $200 that basically you operated through a set of toggle switches that could basically do multiplication if you were lucky. And so I was always interested in it, but that was how I ended up learning about it and working with it. Yeah.
And so I
And then,
know that you started writing and publishing technical manuals at that time. Is
yeah.
that correct?
Yes, it is. I actually had a friend, a sister-in-law of a friend, was a tech writer. And she said, I have this job that I don't have time to do. She was,
Mm.
and you have an English major, so you can probably write. You want to try this. So I did. And as you say, it was explaining, and nonfiction writing, while I find incredibly hard, I could do it. And so it was agonizing. I spent about 8 agonizing years doing tech writing because
Mm.
it was just really hard.
Yeah, and we'll get to the writing part and the
Yeah,
agonizing part. But I want to understand how this transition happens between writing technical manuals and
yeah,
getting into usability and writing about that.
right. good question. I'll have to think about it a little bit. Basically, what was the sequence exactly? I did it through a friend, and I realized a couple of years, like 10 years ago, I finally realized that basically every job that I've ever had, every important transition to a new job that I've ever had came through some form of nepotism. That basically it was either a friend or friends of friends that I never was able to network. I wasn't any good at it. I knew wouldn't be any good at it, so I didn't do it. But I always had some friend or a friend of friends who said, "Oh, you should try this,"
Mm.
and handed me an opportunity. And so my advice to people who ask me how to find a job has gone from the usual or some version of don't ask me, I don't really know, to develop friends who are smarter and more ambitious than you are.
Yep.
And they'll hand you opportunities. So that one, so the transition from tech writing, so I had finished tech writing and I had finally learned how to do it. I had finally gotten to the point where it wasn't like incredibly horrifying to start a new project. And I was working with a startup and they started including me on the design meetings, the interface design meetings, because they knew that I was spending more time thinking about the interface than they were. And it was very nice of them and it was very helpful and it partly shifted my gears a little. And then this friend of mine basically had gotten a job working for Symantec, a company that did utilities, doing utility software for the Mac. And he said his boss wanted to know something about their users and said, maybe you could do something. Maybe you could interview a couple of users. And so I did. So I
Mm.
interviewed like 5 users, what would be called contextual inquiry. Now I went to their offices and sat with them and watched what they did and talked to them about the software they used and what they wanted. And I did a report and his boss loved the report because it was good. I still have a couple of quotes from it that I use from time to time. And then they said, maybe we should do some of this usability testing. You think you could do that? So basically, I dug up one of Jacob Nielsen's first books at the time, and from that book, learned how to do usability testing and started doing usability testing. So that was the segue.
Awesome.
Have smart, ambitious friends.
Yeah. Opening doors for you. That's great.
And it was more fun. It was a lot more fun than writing.
Yeah. And it does involve removing barriers for understanding, which later became a whole field. So I'd love to hear how the book came about, Don't Make Me Think, in that context.
Yep.
And then I'll dive into some specific topics in usability and UX. But this book, it's sold over 600,000 copies.
Yeah.
It shaped a generation of designers, UX designers, usability experts, user research specialists, and me and my own career. And I'm so curious, how did it come about?
Again, I refer you back to point B, have friends who are smarter and more ambitious than you are.
Nice.
I'd been doing consulting. So then I started doing usability consulting. So I would do mostly expert reviews where I would go in and use the thing and tell people what was going to be confusing for their users. And sometimes I do usability tests for them. And that was fine. I was very happy, always had clients. And I was consulting for an odd company. It was called At Home and it was in California. And it was the first attempt to provide internet through cable TV. And they were going to roll out across the country and they had deals with all the big cable TV providers and whatnot. And they started in California and established a base. And it turned out that they were ahead of their time, that getting installers into houses to configure internet and whatever was just too much and it fell apart. But anyway, I was consulting for them for a while, and Roger Black, who's a renowned designer at the time, newspapers and magazines, print design, and he's redesigned newspapers all over the world and did the original design for Rolling Stone magazine and redesigned either Time or Newsweek, I can never remember which one, and whatever. So if you're in typography at all, you know Roger Black. And he was consulting on design of this service, the interface of the service. So we had worked together, and he had his company had written a book. He wrote a book with somebody about designing websites a few years before, 95 maybe, that did well. And it was a good book and it did well. And so they had this idea that we'll do a series of books on web design, because this was like 1998, 99. And so it was becoming a huge thing. And there still weren't many books out about it. And so they were going to do a series of books about different topics. And we were having lunch one day in sunny California where this client was. And he said, "Oh, you could do a book about usability."
Mm.
And I said, but I couldn't take, I'm a really slow writer and I couldn't take the time off to do it. And he said, "I'll get you in advance." And so he got me, because he was Roger Black. He's like he's wonderful. He's an incredibly charming person and one of the best storytellers I know. And so he made a deal with the publisher to do a series of books that his company would find the authors, find editors, design the books, and basically hand them over to the publisher to print and
Right.
distribute. And so he made like a 5-book deal or something, and got me in advance, got me a ridiculous advance. So you probably know a little bit about books, and I've said
Yeah.
this before. He got me $40,000 advance as an
Wow.
unknown writer of a technical book.
Right.
So if you were doing a technical book, you get $1,000 advance. You're doing really well.
Yeah,
And
for
they're
sure.
like really behind you.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So this was ludicrous. This was, and not only that, it was the Orson Welles deal. It was like I had complete control.
Amazing.
Nobody was going to mess with me
Yeah.
because I was working through Roger. Basically, Roger's company was going to be handling all of it. So I didn't have anybody on the publisher's end who was
Nice.
going to give me a hard time. And Roger was obviously completely in support and whatever. And that's part of the reason why the book came out the way it did, honestly, is because of that. I knew from years of doing the tech manuals and doing illustrations myself and laying them out and designing them from a typesetting background and whatever, I kind of knew what I wanted. And Roger helped me get it and found an illustrator who was perfect. And part of the reason why I did it, one of the biggest reasons why I did it, was because I thought, if I have a book, I can raise my consulting fees. It's Jacob Nielsen at the time was charging like 5 times what I would charge for a day rate, or 10 times what I would charge for a day rate. And I didn't have the nerve to even raise mine by 50% because I had no reputation. I had always done what the clients I had always passed me on to other people, but I'd never done presentations. I didn't have articles or a book or whatever. And so I thought, if I have a book, then I would have the nerve to raise my consulting rates, and that would make it worthwhile in the long run. Because I certainly, as you can imagine, never expected to make a penny back beyond the $40,000.
Right.
So we would be lucky if it paid that off.
Even if it was fairly successful.
Even if it was very successful. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that was it. So Roger made the deal, and I spent a year being miserable. So far over my head, I'd never written anything. That's not quite true, but I almost never written anything book length. There were so many moving parts, and it was writing. But finally, I did get done out of sheer panic and fear and desperation. Got done.
The book it's not something you would expect out of necessarily out of a professional book. It has a very friendly tone. It has illustrations, cartoons, all these things. And it's a delight. It's still really fun to read. Do you have a theory about why you did this? Like, what's the role of humor or the tone? What did you try to do there?
I guess that I had done writing like that before. In fact, even back in the typesetting days, we had to make up you have a typesetting sample book that shows the fonts that your machine is capable of producing. And so you have samples. And I remember I wrote the samples for the sample books, and they were in that same style.
That's funny. Yeah.
And my father always he collected a lot of books. And I remember in the bookcase in our living room, there was a shelf, and up on one of the higher shelves that I could get to at the time was a book called David Copperfield or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Okay.
I remember looking at that book and thinking, oh, what the heck? What's going on there? And it was a book by Robert Benchley, who was an American humorist writer in the 20s and through 40s, and probably one of the best American humor writers. And so when I got to college, I actually started reading Benchley and thought I just loved it. It was just so wonderful and funny. So I'd always appreciated that. And the other part of it is I feel like I often say I've always thought a big part of my job was to keep myself amused. So
it's a good attitude. Yeah.
I know a lot of people who think that, and it's a good way to have a career. I guess I knew that the best writing I did was like that. It was the kind of writing I would want to read. So there are a couple of elements. One, start at the beginning, back up as far as necessary so that nobody's lost at the beginning. Explain from basics, and don't assume that you're going to offend people by explaining basics, because as long as you do a good, interesting explanation of basics, even the people who know them will go, "Oh, yeah, that's a good explanation," and they'll enjoy reading it. So don't be afraid to back up. And so I think the book lives up to that. And profusely illustrated, I think it's been one of its biggest things that's made it popular. Is it's just so, I don't like to read that much, honestly. I read, but I don't want, if I open up a big fat book
Yeah.
and see this page after page of uninterrupted text, and I'm tired already. But I also didn't want to. I feel strongly that doing that is not making things clear and simple is in no way related to dumbing things down. It has a
Yeah.
bad reputation.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I didn't dumb anything. So yeah, I'm very proud of it. I feel like it was the best thing I've done,
It's
work wise.
both
But
books they're exactly what you're describing, and they start from the beginning. They are dead simple in language, in kind of clarity, no obfuscation, no big technical words, and yet they teach you everything you need to know about how to think about these things. And for me, it was definitely it was a revelation. I think I told you before, when I read this. Up until that point, I was a geek trying to create cool things and designing things that I thought were cool, but then realizing that there's this whole aspect of the cognitive, educational, simple aspect of things. You're there to facilitate someone else's mind as they go through something, and that opened up. That was like a big revelation, and I think it was literally. I could definitely trace my career as two halves, like before reading that book and after reading that book. And
I love that story.
I definitely made more money and was was a lot more successful after reading the book. And yeah, I want to ask you, this was one of the big steps to popularizing usability, but there's all these terms that cropped up later: usability, user experience, UX. And now a lot of people are calling them, including me, calling ourselves product designer. And what are your thoughts about all these terms and how they're related or different, or is it just meaningless terminology? What do you think?
I have a number of reactions. One, it's beyond me. I feel like an old country doctor, general practitioner who's constantly getting these journals in the mail.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That makes sense. I don't even really have time to read all of this. There's so many subspecialties, and
Yeah.
I'm on the one hand, I'm glad it's going on. I see a bunch of the stuff, and I see where it makes sense that it would be very useful. And so I'm glad that there are people who are doing it. I'm glad it's not me. But it also it worries me a little bit how segmented it's gotten, whether it's things are getting lost in the segmentation and the internecine warfare, and our proprietary methodology is better and more important and more useful than yours, which I understand. Part of it is it's a business. I've always hated consulting firms that have a proprietary methodology. Just tell us you're good. Show us some stuff. It's like, don't tell us there's this magic engine that you drop it into that's been developed by scientists in Zurich, and just do a good job and have your clients recommend you to us. But that's me. I am a country doctor, and I can afford to take that attitude, and I'm not in that competition.
Yeah.
At all. On the one hand, I feel like it's a good thing. I feel like it's great that so many people are interested in the user and think that the user is important. I think that's great. And certainly I feel like most of that came from, it's probably wrong, but I always think that most of that came from Steve Jobs. It came from the fact that Apple showed that you can make money by designing things
Definitely
that
one
people
of
like.
Yeah, definitely one of the major.
I always say that he and what's his name, Ivy, the designer, designer.
Johnny Ives.
Johnny Ives. Yeah. They did I'm trying to think of an abbreviation, where you prove that something is worth its investment. The
ROI.
the ROI. They did the ROI test case for user-centered design.
Yeah. And today there's so much more than that. Recently I saw research from McKinsey showing that design-centric companies have twice the ROI of similar companies in the same industry that aren't spending a lot of time on design practices.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And part of my problem, though, is that it feels like way back when we, in the dark ages, and user-centered design certainly was around. It just didn't get much attention. That we were always trying to get a seat at the table. That was the phrase that was in our heads. We were trying to get a seat at the table. We knew that this was really important, and that these people who were making these decisions were not paying enough attention to users. And we understood why they were doing it, and we understood that. And there was the whole, well, maybe if we learn to speak their language and we learn business talk and we can explain it to them that way, then maybe we'll get a seat at the table. And nothing got us a seat at the table. In fact, I was really skeptical about it. I said for a long time that usability and user-centered design is unlikely to ever become a necessary line item in every budget the way marketing is. I was not optimistic about it, and then it turned around. But the only thing that concerns me now is, so back then we were struggling for a seat at the table. Now it's like a food fight for a seat at the table, because now instead of a couple of sad little usability, user-centered design people trying to raise their voices, you've got everybody and his or her brother or sister is trying to get that seat at the table and saying, no, wait, we own design. No, it's not called design. Wait, it's called this. No, it's, you know, we should be making those decisions. You got to listen to us. And that, it's fine. I suppose my guess is it'll settle itself out, but I'm glad I'm not in that fray. And I certainly don't want anybody to ask me to express an opinion about who's right and who's got the better proprietary method, or whose job description should include X. I know you're going to fight it out for some years, so go ahead. Wake me when it's over. I wish them all well. I really do. I feel like it's a good thing. It's just I'm glad I'm not involved in it.
Yeah, for sure. I actually think there is value to all these different tools and methodologies. I'm less concerned with the different branding. Some people brand themselves UX, some people brand themselves product designers, some people. What I thought about it, and with how have we moved away from your book? And I think that the main thing that I'm concerned about is you actually try to make this accessible for everyone. It wasn't the professional who's trained to be a designer This was, hey, if you have if you're a developer, if you're a manager, it's still a good practice for you to talk to users. It's still a good practice for you to think about.
I was trying to talk to people who this wasn't their day job.
And I think for good and ill, we're moving in a more professional direction. And I guess this leads me to my next question. Like, do you think can anybody be a great usability expert? I know anybody can be better than they are, but can anybody be a great usability expert, UX expert, or does it take a certain kind of person?
Trick question. I don't know. I've always, with the usability testing, so the rocket surgery book, basically just about usability testing, that specifically was trying to encourage everybody to be doing usability testing, no matter who they were. And so so you're designing this form, do a cubicle test. Go hand it to somebody and ask them to fill it out and get them to think out loud while they're doing it. You should be doing this, because you're not going to get somebody to come around and do it for you, because there just aren't enough experts doing it. So that was the rocket surgery was an attempt at democratization, I guess, basically saying no reason why everybody shouldn't be doing this. You won't be doing as good a job as the experts, but on the other hand, you will. I would bet that you'll improve what you're doing by doing it. Sure. So why not? It's like I have seen very few cases where people made things worse by listening to users. It's possible.
Sometimes they don't know who to listen to. Yeah. Sometimes they
don't know who to listen to. Yeah. Or they have an axe to grind. They want this feature dead, and so they skew the results, or they don't hear what they don't want to hear, and they don't report what they don't want to report. It happens, but I don't think it happens that much.
Yeah, I'm constantly running into entrepreneurs who are more on the technical side, and I think it's critical for them to be able to evaluate themselves in terms of, do I have the right type of skills to be able to do this myself? And if not, how can I recognize it in someone else, given that I don't have it myself?
So we're back to Trump then, and the empathy question. If you have no empathy, are you capable of
I don't know if
running a government?
I don't know if it's no empathy.
I know, but that's the buzzword. Yeah. That's the current buzzword.
Yeah.
All right, actually, let me depart there for a second because I do feel like empathy. I tell this story, and I have 5 stories, so this is one of them. About that I was at I still call it the UPA, Usability Professionals Association. They changed it to the UX, User Experience Professionals Association, like 7 years ago, in what I refer to as a land grab because I knew somebody else was going to do it. And it was a sensible move. It was a good move. But I was at the conference, and there was one night at the conference when they would have a banquet, and they'd have a hypnotist or improvisational sketch group or something perform, and everybody would come together and have dinner. And I was at that banquet night, and I looked around this big hotel banquet room, and I thought, these are really nice people. I knew a number of people there from the years, from having gone for years, and thought, this is like my professional community, and there are hardly any jerks. It's like that, like there weren't, people were drinking, but they weren't being stupid.
That's funny.
And all of a sudden this light bulb lit up over my head, which is like, oh wait, by definition, to do this job, to want to do this job as a career, you probably are a fairly empathetic person. It's like a career requirement. And that made sense to me. I think you could probably be a decent usability expert or user experience expert and still be a jerk. I think it would be possible. I think you could even be somebody without a ton of empathy, and
I know a few of them.
learn to do it. You could learn to do it, and you understand what's required, and you do those things. And so I think it's possible. So basically, are there people who are not cut out to be? It depends on what you is expert. The people you're talking about dealing with, the technology-oriented people, they don't need to be experts.
So there's this book, Made to Stick. I don't know if you read it, but
I read the first chapter of it, as I do with many of these books. Yeah.
Nice. I think I skimmed through it, but they talk about the curse of knowledge, which is this idea that the more expert you are in some skill, the harder it is for you to explain to someone who doesn't know it, because it's hard for you to even imagine what it's like to not know the thing that you know. And the deeper your expertise goes, the harder it is to explain it to someone in some cases. And what I've always found is people who are very technical, engineers, people who love technology and love figuring out complex technologies, they can't even imagine what it's like to be a user landing on this and not understanding anything.
Yeah.
And theoretically, anybody could learn to do this, but it seems like it's also pretty different from their normal skills of technical ability and learning how to run a business, etc.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense, and it's a good explanation, a good question. When I talk about usability testing, I say the problem is that if you're too close to the thing yourself, too much, and it's really hard to not know what you know, and it's really hard to understand that other people don't know that's like the big barrier. That's like whatever the thing was in Star Trek, the barrier that you can, and that's part of the reason why I always felt like the best thing for that was usability testing, was getting people to actually watch usability tests, because you can only, I've seen so many people who broke through that barrier just by sitting through a couple of usability tests where as I like to say, it really is like light bulb goes off over their head where they go, holy crap. They actually don't understand that. It's like here, it's kind of like, holy crap, people actually would vote for Trump. And they actually have reason, and there are real reasons why they would vote for Trump. If I put myself in their shoes, I can understand why they would do that, even though they think he's as gross as I do. So it's kind of the same thing. And I always felt like the best fix for that was to get them to have them watch usability tests.
That makes sense.
Because so often when you're sitting there in the back room, you get that experience where you say, oh, wow, they've never actually watched anybody use it. So they figure everybody is like them. And
interesting.
Often for the first couple of users, they'll be resistant and they'll say that person's just stupid. And then after they've gotten to the third person who didn't understand this thing that they thought was so obvious, it's like, gee, he seems like an intelligent human being. I think it just washes over you. So is everybody educable in that way? I feel like almost, to get them at least past that barrier a little bit. That certainly doesn't mean they're going to want to do it, or they're going to be an expert, or they're going to want to whatever.
Yeah.
But I guess I have no sense at all of how much this has washed over the whole technical community. How many people actually now understand that their users are not them? I feel like it's massively more than was, but I
Yeah.
probably overestimate. I probably feel like things are better than they are.
I think
Which in a sense is fine, because I would like for my book to keep selling, but it's a little disturbing. What do you think?
I think it's definitely accepted wisdom in kind of the top echelons of the most successful, most professional companies, but you still encounter many organizations and departments within organizations and startups where that's just not the case.
Really? Even with
Yeah.
lean UX and whatever being so fashionable?
Well,
Huh.
because if you talk about the professional UX people, then they would all agree with you,
Right.
though
Right.
sometimes they don't get the support from the organizations to do this.
Really? Okay.
Because the timelines. So with Agile, they're like, okay, you got a week. Give me wireframes to start
Yeah.
building. So some of them don't do it because they can't. And then some organizations, there's still a lot of organizations where the power of design is not understood until they hit a wall with the users.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
And then they're like, oh yeah, there's this mostly with AI, cyber, very technical fields where they think algorithmically and they think because they have the right algorithm that everything is solved. But then how do you give an algorithm to someone in a way that they know how to
Right.
deploy? It's interesting. I have two last questions for you. One is, so you write about this upcoming book about writing, and I would love to hear, given that you said it, tell me how this project came about, and then what's happening with it. When can we see something?
The W word, yeah. It came about because I have always found writing to be incredibly hard and painful, and something that I'd much rather avoid. And given any opportunity to avoid it, I will. Sadly, it seems like when I am forced to do it, I do it well. So I guess, and over the years, do you know David Allen? Do you know the Getting Things Done guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know him
So
personally, but
I actually know him personally, in the
Right.
sense that I had what David Letterman used to call a brush with greatness. I sat next to David Allen on a flight from Boston to LA, or vice
Nice.
versa, many years ago, 92 or something. And he had a huge laptop, and he was working on this program. It was like Lotus Agenda. I forget what it was, but he was organizing his to-do list.
Okay.
And my boss had actually looked at this same program and had tried using it. And so I asked him about it, what he thought of it. And he
Yes.
ended up telling me what he did. And I ended up going to one of his first public workshops, I think,
Wow.
in Boston, not long after that. And I actually, I use a lot of stuff that I learned from that workshop every day ever since. I'm
Yeah.
still not organized. I'm still subject to incredible procrastination, whatever, but it did make things better for me. And so David Allen, so I read a lot of stuff that David Allen writes and blogs and whatnot. And one of the things that he said once, or a number of times that I've heard him say, was that he became fascinated with and worked really hard on getting organized because he was lazy. He considers himself incredibly lazy, and being organized made it easier to be made it less troublesome to be lazy. And I feel that way with writing. Is I've always looked for easy ways out with writing, or things that would just make it a little bit easier. And because it makes me feel lazy, writing makes me feel lazy. It's not, that's not the problem, actually. It turns out I now understand a lot more about procrastination, and in fact have 80 pages of notes for a 10-page chapter on procrastination in this proposed book about writing.
Wonderful.
But so I was basically looking for things to make it easier for me, and I have found some things over the years. That's like, I've been writing since 1980, as at least big part of my work. So writing and hating it since 1980. It's like our company tagline.
Can you give me a taste of the kind of advice? So procrastination is really interesting. I read a whole book about, I think it's called The War of Art. Have you read that?
No.
It's all about resistance and procrastination in writing, but
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it.
it's horrible. When I read it, it's good, but when I read it, I decided to not write any fiction ever because I was like, if this is what it takes, I don't want to do it. No, never. uh,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so what kind of advice do you have for us that you think might be not present in kind of the standard writing book?
First off, a lot of it will be present in a number of writing books. There are so many books about writing and, in a sense, about making writing easier. There are so many of them. Some of them are very good. There's one in particular, which I won't be able to think of the name of, that is really quite good and has been sort of out there for years. The author died like 10 years ago, but it's still big, huge seller. And that's very good. A lot of the stuff, if you say advice that I would give, a lot of it's very similar to stuff you'll find in a lot of other books. I feel like I could explain it better.
Mm,
As you say, I would make it more accessible.
yeah.
And less the part of the problem, there's a problem with those books that they're all, you pick up one of those books and you read it and say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, why don't you do that? And you do that for a week and then you don't do it anymore. And it may even
Yeah.
work really well for a week, but then you don't do it anymore. Or you're reading through that book and you're like, okay, that's a really good idea. That's a really good idea. Wait, here's another 200 pages of really good ideas. Am I going to
Right.
keep reading? So I think I could do a good, useful, approachable, helpful book about making writing easier. I guess that's my tagline, whatever. I believe that. It's like I could do the same thing as I did with Don't Make Me Think. I am confident of that,
Nice.
which has kept me interested in it. I've been sending myself emails for probably 7 years now. I've been sending myself emails with thoughts about what would go in the book. So I have this huge collection of notes, and all that's left is to write it.
Amazing. When
You want
can
one? You want
pre-order?
one? No. Do you want one of the tips? I'll give you one. I'll try and give you
Sure.
one of the tips.
Sure.
But as far as pre-ordering, yeah, my explanation of it's the same. I have the Orson Welles deal because basically I feel like if I can write it, I would have no trouble getting it published.
Right.
So I can just write it the way I want it and then get it published, which is an incredible luxury. But there's a lot to it, obviously. But every time I go back to it and work on it, I get really excited about it again. It's sustained my interest for a long time now. And I do feel like it's probably the thing I should do. When my stated deadline is hopefully while I still have enough brain cells left to finish it. That's my stated optimistic deadline I don't have a deadline and I don't have anybody putting pressure on me about it, which is both good and bad.
I'm going to put some pressure on you right now.
Okay.
I really want to read this book.
You know what? You don't want to read it nearly as much as I do.
Right. That's probably right. That's probably right.
I can give you one, which is one of my favorites, but I have a feeling that it'll be interesting to see because I haven't circulated anything really. And I have no idea. I may send some of this stuff to people and they'll say, oh yeah, like that's nice. But one of the things that I like best, which I don't expect that other people will, is the whole thing of you're working on a sentence, you're working on over, and you feel like you can't find quite the right word. There's one part of this thing where you can't find the right word or phrase, and you've tried a whole bunch of things, and they all seem right, but none of them strike you, and none of them hit that chord where it's like, oh yeah, that's it. And the tip is, if you find yourself in that situation where you can't find the right word, the problem is not finding the right word. The problem is what you're trying to say is not what you mean. You haven't thought it through. So take that as a golden clue that you need to rethink this. You need to step back from this and say, what am I trying to say here? And say that. If you can say that to another person, that's even better. You can say it a couple of times, but just keep stepping back and saying, wait, what am I trying to say here? Don't go looking for the word anymore. It's like you can spend months looking for the word or the phrase and think that's just not right. And I think we've all had that. I shouldn't say that. I think a lot of people have that experience when they're writing. And I discovered that a long time ago. And that was a very useful one.
That's great. And I can see how that would lead to simpler and clearer ideas at the end.
And honestly, that's partly what I'm getting at there, probably is partly the same kind of revelation as people going past that barrier of not knowing that other people don't see their stuff the way they do. It's that barrier of understanding that if you're having trouble writing it, you don't understand it yet. That's the barrier you have to get past. You have to understand that it's not that you're having a hard time writing, it's that what you're trying to write is not the right thing. And you need to think some more.
That's
And you need
interesting.
to, and at the same time, it's very hard to get yourself to step back at that point. At that point, you've got so much sunk cost, and you're so convinced that because you've worked on it for so long, you're so convinced that thing that you're trying to polish and perfect is the right thing. If only you could polish and perfect. It's very hard to let go of that and step back and say, wait, what do I really mean? Because you did that a long time ago, and you've been convinced that you know what you really mean. So it's that kind.
That's
the kind of insight I'm like hoping to trick people into.
I like that, and that feels very that feels like it has the same quality as the other books of making something really complex, really accessible. So that's great. I'm even more excited now. So you have to get writing. I'll send a note to David Allen telling him he should reach out. So I have one final question for you. If
sure.
You can spare a couple.
Yeah.
In his TED Talk, Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a sermon and a lecture. And he says a lecture is trying to give you just a little bit of information, and a sermon is trying to change your life. And so I want to give you a stage for a short sermon in the field of product, in the field of usability, in the field of that you've been spending most of your life writing about. What is one thing that really could change their life, can change how they see things if they do it, if they do right? What's your short sermon for people? And take it whichever way you want to take it.
Okay. Part of something I did say before, which is, I think, is assume that people don't know very much about what you're talking about, but don't hold that against them. Don't treat that as their problem. Respect their intelligence. And act like that's the most normal thing in the world. Like you're going to explain this from the beginning. You're going to try and explain it in a somewhat engaging or interesting way, and maybe throw in something about it that they likely don't know. But you're going to respect their intelligence, but appreciate the fact that they don't know what you know. So don't feel like giving a simple, clear explanation is talking down to people.
Yeah.
People appreciate. I love a good explanation.
Yeah.
Even if it's something that I know a lot about, I love reading a good explanation of it, because in a sense it either solidifies what I know a little more, or resurfaces what I know, or gives me a slightly new way of thinking about it. But mostly it's respect their intelligence. And I feel like in my books there's a bunch of stuff where it's not all like incredibly simple language. There's a fair amount of stuff in it that's relatively sophisticated, or obscure cultural references, which I try and clarify when necessary. So it doesn't have that feeling of Dick and Jane see Spot run. It's kind of sophisticated. But the assumption behind it is you're a smart person, and I know you want to learn about this, so I'm going to try and explain it as best I can.
Yeah.
So it's a respect thing, which came from my mother, because she wasn't judgmental. There you go. Circle closed.
Circle closed. I love that. I resonate, and I feel like I've been most of my life, at least professionally, been like that, where the reason I'm able to work with clients well is I say, okay, you're an expert at what you do. Let me explain something that you don't know, and that's fine. Right. And there's many things that I don't know. It's okay not to know.
Oh, that was one of my hugest lessons, I think, was from way back when. It's when it suddenly dawned on me, it's okay to say, I don't know. I don't have an answer for your question. Or I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand. Can you explain it to me? Like that was professionally, that was like, you can't get anywhere until you hit that one.
I agree. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Steve. This has been a very meaningful and really fascinating conversation.
Oh, good. I'm glad. It's really, honestly, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I knew it would be, because I listened to that interview. So that was why I did it. I manage to do almost nothing nowadays. I have to say no to almost everything, because I am trying to write. And if I don't say no to everything, then I won't get any writing done.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, thank you so much.
All right. Good. Stay healthy.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app. or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.